worked with manatees, the more I realized there was an absence of information, descriptive information on the morphology of those guys in general, and so I wanted to get my physical description up to the quality of my seal and sea lion and dolphin morphology. And then I spent a little more than 10 years in the Path Lab, and I think that actually the manatee anatomy is probably the most detailed now. It far exceeds the other ones because I had very little distraction, spent most of my time doing necropsies of manatees. Did about 3,500 in the 10 years I was there. And so being immersed with manatees was easy to acquire a little bit more depth. One of the most interesting projects was trying to figure out whether small boats or large boats killed manatees, and doing that analysis based on the size and shape of cuts in the skin was just one of the more satisfying projects, and that was a very useful project, and it also put to bed the idea. We had probably at least once a week, usually a couple times a week, one of my colleagues, Tom Pitchford, was on the phone with somebody, some irate fisherman or boater, saying, why are we doing this? We aren't doing really science. We were challenged regularly. Our interpretation of watercraft injury was challenged on a regular basis. And then we lucked out one day. An older guy came in, and he was on the governor's boating task force or something like that, and he wanted to see necropsy. And it turns out his family made equipment for slaughterhouses or something like that. And because of that, he wasn't afraid of the gore in there. Most boaters took one look at a dead manatee and wanted to get out of the room, and Bill Albright is his name, and he ended up being an official volunteer. And he started bringing in, once he realized we were serious scientists, he started bringing in boaters from some of the more arch enemies of the manatee world. And within a couple of years, that major problem, administrative problem, became negligible. It just sort of disappeared as they realized we were doing serious science. And that was probably one of the more satisfying projects, although it wasn't what you call rocket science. It ended up being very practical science.
Useful.
Very, very useful.
So for those young people that may not be familiar with the process, can you just provide a brief description of what the Path Lab is and why it's important for manatees to have this facility? What kind of comes out of it?
Well, I think originally the Path Lab, Marine Mammal Pathobiology Lab in St. Petersburg, Florida, was originally established, I think, to determine whether or not watercraft were killing manatees. And approximately a quarter, over the years, about approximately a quarter of the manatees that die each year die because of watercraft-induced wounds. And so the original idea was just, I think there's some people in Tallahassee that didn't believe this, and so it was more or less just a documentation of how many manatees were dying, and of them, that number, how many were killed by boats. And it kind of stayed in a pretty much a documentation level for a number of years until Tom Pitchford and Alex Kostidas and I developed this method for interpreting watercraft marks. So essentially, bring a dead manatee into the lab and you examine it externally and to record the size, shape, and position of new injuries and old injuries if they leave some kind of a mark. And through the analysis of those injuries, and working on some mathematical models of how a propeller could possibly cut a flat surface, a round surface, and so on. We eventually developed this method of interpretation that has since been applied to other beasts like dolphins and whales. And so essentially examine the outside of the animal and then look for internal injuries, signs of trauma on the inside. So the necropsy procedure at the Path Lab originally was simply to determine whether or not the animal sustained some kind of injury. in addition to that was the examination of the general health. And managers wanted to know if manatees were healthy. For a while, people believed that maybe only sick manatees were being killed by boats. So determining the relative health of the animal was important. The problem is that manatees are big, they're hindgut digesters. That means that they are loaded with bacteria in their guts, and Florida is warm. So close to a third, sometimes a half of the manatees that we got were essentially decomposed, advanced stage of decomposition. So it's difficult to determine cause of death, except for traumatic cause of death. So we became really good at determining injuries sustained by the skeleton, and my interest originally was skeletal morphology. So those two things fit together quite nicely.
Now the work that you just described on quantifying and having actual metrics for, we have this degree of confidence that this kind of vessel caused that injury, and that's what led to the death of this manatee. If I'm not mistaken, some of that kind of data has been used in court cases, right?
Yes, well, there was the hope that we could develop something that would stand up in court, and we found that personal opinion, what do we call it, professional opinion, is the kind of logic that's used in a courtroom is very different than the kind of logic that's used in the scientific community. So we went about it a slightly different way. We published two papers, one on how manatees die after sustaining injury from boats, and we published that in a veterinary journal, and then we published the interpretation of marks on the animal in the Journal of Marine Mammal Biology, and so marine mammalogy, and so those two papers being reviewed in reputable journals pretty much took the wind out of the sails of our major critics, and then I think that they stopped taking us to court at that point because they realized that we now had peer-reviewed evidence. Being prepared, if somehow we as mentors can help our students become prepared for unfair and sometimes irrational criticism, it's going to happen, you know, and so check your work, make sure you're right, and then hang in there, you know, or find another way to demonstrate it, you know, or get out of Dodge, you know, find something else to do. Sometime when I was in grad school, there was this brilliant paper that came out. One of my grad students friends came up and he says, "Look at this! Isn't this great? This is in Science." And at that time, Science was hot, and he says, "Look at the footnote. It says this is identical to the manuscript I submitted 25 years ago. It has been rejected, but it took 25 years for the background information to get high enough to register." And I think that every person I have met has had at least one critic out there, formal, unbiased scientific reviewer who was totally wrong. Sometimes they're right, and you need that. So I like our review process, but I think that sometimes some senior people take advantage of that and are not very forgiving in allowing newcomers to come in and challenge the dogma. I think you'd be very careful about dogma.
So what about the reward side? What would be some positive events or occurrences that just were very pleasant surprises to you that you didn't even know were coming?
The diaphragm thing would, I'd say, because I actually, John and I both taught comparative anatomy, but I teach it very differently than John did. And coming into biology from engineering, I tend to teach it more of a functional way, and so I introduce the body differently. And after I introduce the skeleton, I introduce the diaphragm, and I always draw it in there and connect it to the sternum. And manatee diaphragm didn't do that. What they were calling the diaphragm isn't that; it's embryonically something else. And that, I think, was serendipitously one of the coolest things. I think the secondary effect of our papers on watercraft injury was very satisfying in taking the heat off of the negative critics. And then I think the confluence of the reproductive coolers, that manatees, dolphins, and seals, but not sea lions, all cooler reproductive systems using different vascular structures.
Right.
So this is really kind of interesting that the vascular system is so plastic, if you will, that evolutionarily plastic, so that it can be taken advantage of in so many different ways. That the bodies of the beasts we study are just so complex, and their history is so long that you can take and change things. A lot of the things that we find are physiological in marine mammals are pathological in terrestrial mammals.
Right.
That is,
Right.
I think you've got to take that in.
Like the corneal vascularization
Yes.
of the
Yeah.
manatee eye would be
Yeah.
another example.
So, yeah.
So let's turn to our audience and ask the question, given the history of your involvement in marine mammal science, and particularly, for this purpose in manatee biology and anatomy and all these things we've been talking about, when you think about young people that have an interest in manatees and are thinking about making a career in one or more aspects of manatee biology or conservation, what sort of things do you think of that are different now than they were when you were coming up? And what kind of advice or thoughts do you have that you would like to convey to those young people out there?
Well, today, the good old days are right now. I mean, the new tools, stuff that Alex is using now with, non-invasive imaging, telemetry, those things are such great tools. There are ways of us applying questions or looking for answers that we can never dream of before. But nothing takes the place of solid work. You want to find some shoulders to stand on, examine the literature, and examine a broad spectrum of literature. Take something that you're interested in, a system or a concept, and try and find a way that someone has fitted that concept into the literature, and then stand or kneel or look over the shoulders of the people, because there are a lot of bright people that have gone before us. Some of the best science was done 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. Not so much with the biochemistry and other stuff, but in terms of observation of the beast, or gross anatomy, that sort of thing. That 100 years ago, there's still some beautiful work that was being done. So look at that. Don't start thinking about a project and consider that all the literature is available on Google or something like that. Dig into the old literature. Find out something about the history of the beast and the kind of thinking that goes with it. And don't stick to one species. Look at a bunch of other beasts. Just, if nothing else, just so you see that the thing you were interested in is a variation. It's always the case in, say, a manatee, is not the case in another beast. So somehow at least consider some kind of comparison, and then find a concept and start small and build. A lot of small things you can step on. If you take one big thing and you fail, you get this floppy thing as a failure. Not that you shouldn't try projects that are difficult, but you won't know whether they're impossible or not until after you've finished. But pick a project and build on it and find criticism. Find somebody, even if their person is not in your endeavor, and ask what do they think about it. And if everybody says it's a piece of crap, it may be a piece of crap, but it may not. It may not. And so I think that become impassioned. Try and develop some kind of respect from your colleagues. Try and develop a collegial working group. Don't go out and look for people who agree with you and then get their respect. Right. Go out and find somebody who's going to challenge you, and then share it with new minds too. Go to new audiences. I think some of the best questions I've ever gotten on skeletal morphology were from 5th graders because they have got good minds. They just don't know a lot, so they're uninhibited.
Right.
They're not afraid to ask the question that graduate students would be embarrassed. Oh, I'm supposed to know this answer,
right.
Therefore I will not comment.
Right.
And so I think it's okay to be embarrassed. Just don't want to be embarrassed all the time. But it's okay to be embarrassed. Just expect to be embarrassed. Expect to be wrong.
Right.
You know. And there was a guy by the name of Vincent Didier. You ever heard the name of this insect neurophysiologist? Incredible man. And he said, fill your lab with people who disagree with you.
Mm-hmm.
And he came out of like Cavendish or something like, you know, I mean, where these guys were getting Nobel Prizes every day. And he said the guy he worked with originally was a physicist. He locked the doors on Friday. He says, leave it alone for a couple days and then come back. You beat at it all the time, and maybe you'll get through. But I think stepping back, read a book, something that's not science, you know, read a poem, go for a walk, get out of Dodge once in a while, and then go back with a fresh mind and tackle the project. And I think that, at least in my experience, that's always been far more productive.
That's good advice, yeah.
I don't think that anything that we observe in morphology just happened, you know. I think that this thing, you know, occurred because the precursors were there. You didn't get when I started looking at Reedy mirabla and in cetaceans. Here's a wonderful network, just this beautiful thing, and I just couldn't envision a genetic predisposition for that. It just something about that doesn't. And then I found that in embryology, you know, there are a lot of diffuse networks that occur in all vertebrates. Take one of those and proliferate it just a little bit, and you have a Reedy. It's nothing brand new.
Right.
Its application, its form is a little bit differently, but it is. There's nothing brand spanking new except the finished product. And I think that you should go. If you can't find that, you should go looking for it. You know, I think that's really important. And then if you can't find it, then either your thing is very different, or you just haven't looked hard enough.
And one of the things that I'm picking up as you're talking is that you obviously have a perspective that really has elements that intertwine from functional morphology, developmental biology, evolution, the expanse of time you mentioned, and I'm getting the distinct feeling that you take great delight in how those things intersect.
Absolutely,
You know?
absolutely. I think that's probably the most satisfying thing is when you find things that fit. As they say in me, when it fits like a duck's foot in mud. You know, when it fits, you go, oh wow.
Yeah.
And I think that probably one of the tough, until I started this project with Alex and the vascular structures of beaked whale heads, I think the most complicated project I tackled before was the reproductive cooler in seals. And I just stared at those images and stared for months, and then one day it just fit. All of a sudden it was logical. It's there for a reason. The reason may be it's a holdover or something, but chances are really good that there is some function to that. So if you understand the development or look at the development and look for function and then try and find some kind of evolutionary precursor, you've got 3 different avenues that you can tackle a project, and you should really at least consider those at all times. And then always try and don't read just the stuff that applies directly to your stuff. Read the general literature as well. Try and find something to loosen you up a little bit, to step back. And if you have to go into the office 7 days a week, then spend some of that time reading some of the other stuff, so that at least you're not staring at this little tiny thing all the time.
You know, it's in my career, it's been striking to me how many times, and this goes back to your comment about the 5th graders, how many times I'll be at a meeting and maybe even overhearing a conversation in passing that
yes,
something comes out of for
yeah,
me.
that
You know?
chance of favoring the prepare mind. I think
Yeah.
that's the case, and I think our brains are well designed to take advantage of that. Is to look for patterns. We
Yeah.
want to find patterns. Yeah,